The following is part of an ongoing series of distinguished speakers presented by the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. The broadcast of this program is made possible by the generous contributions of the members of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs.
Dr. Robert O. Freedman, Dean of the Peggy Meyerhoff Pearlstone School of Undergraduate Studies at the Baltimore Hebrew University and Professor of Political Science, spoke before the Council on February 5, 1992 at the Hyatt Regency Hotel. Dr. Freedman's address is entitled, "The Middle East Peace Process, Progress and Prospects." Introducing the speaker is Mrs. Sheila K. Riggs, President of Diversified Health Services Incorporated and Co-Chair Board of Trustees of the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs.
Robert Freedman is Professor of Political Science and Dean of the School of Graduate Studies at the Baltimore Hebrew University. The topic of his presentation this evening is the Middle East Peace Process, Progress and Prospects. He is a distinguished authority on foreign affairs in the Middle East, as well as in the former Soviet Union. He also serves as a consultant to our State Department and to the Central Intelligence Agency. Dr. Freedman has served on a Brookings Institute delegation to discuss the Middle East peace process with Yasser Arafat and other PLO leaders. He's been a member of several American delegations which met with Soviet scholars and Soviet government officials to discuss Middle Eastern problems too. He has also visited China to discuss the same issues with scholars and government officials there. He is the author of 4 books on the Soviet Union and the Middle East and of numerous articles. He is currently at work on a book about Soviet-American relations in the Gorbachev era. Dr. Freedman holds a BA degree from the University of Pennsylvania. He is a graduate of Columbia University's Russian Institute, and he received his MA and PhD degrees from Columbia. Prior to coming to Baltimore, he served as Associate Professor of Political Science at Marquette University, and before that as Assistant Professor of Russian History and Government at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Will you join me in welcoming him to the Council, Professor Robert O. Freedman.
Thank you very much for a warm introduction. I feel particularly good being here because I'm also a member of our council and I attend a number of the lectures, and it feels good to continue my participation in a slightly different way tonight. What I'd like to talk about at a time of, I hope, growing optimism about the Middle East peace process is 3 things. First of all, the Middle East is the region probably more riven, more cut by conflict than any other region on the face of the earth. And a lot of the problems in the region interact with the Arab-Israeli peace process. And I want to cover these problems, try to illustrate that. Second point I'm going to try to make this evening is to look at the interests and attitudes of the main players in the region. The Israelis, the Palestinians, the Syrians, the Jordanians, the Lebanese, the Saudis, etc. And at the end, in the remaining time, lay out what I think would be a fair and equitable settlement for all concerned. Hopefully all within 45 minutes or so. Let's see. Okay, I start off with, I think, an element of optimism. We've now finished the 3rd level of the Middle East peace talks in Moscow after the, as you know, the sort of formal opening in Madrid, the bilateral talks in Washington, and the regional talks in Moscow. We see the United States as now the world's only superpower actively pushing the peace process. We see most of the Arab world, with the exception of Libya and Iraq and Yemen, supporting the Middle East peace process. And last but certainly not least, we see the Israeli elections coming on June 23rd, and the issue of what will be involved in the peace process will no doubt be a central issue in the election campaign. Now, to temper the optimism, we have to examine the problems. And there are roughly 10 intrastate problems in the Middle East that do affect the Arab-Israeli peace process. Number one is Lebanon. In Lebanon, there's an internal struggle for power, on the one hand between Christian Arabs speaking generally and Sunni Muslims on the one hand, who resist Syrian control. There's also among two Shia Muslim groups, Amal and Hezbollah, as to who's going to control the southern part of Lebanon. Then Israel and Syria have a proxy war going on in Lebanon, and a certain amount of residual conflict between Israel and the PLO, all being fought out in Lebanon. And Lebanon is just one of the areas of conflict. An Arab-Israeli peace settlement would certainly do much, I think, to help solve the overall Lebanese problem. Second key issue is Israel and the Palestinians. This is actually quite easy to understand. From the Palestinian perspective, they want a state. Their argument is, we are a people, we are a nation. The Egyptian Arabs have Egypt, the Syrian Arabs have Syria, the Iraqi Arabs have Iraq. We Palestinian Arabs should have our own state. They also make the assertion that in 1988, we came out formally in the Palestine National Council with a declaration for a two-state solution. The Israelis should recognize us now and have a two-state solution, Israel and a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza. From their perspective, the Israelis are, and I would say the majority still are rather concerned that the Palestinians in their hearts, despite these magic words of 1988, still want to destroy Israel and would use any West Bank Gaza state as a jumping off point to destroy Israel. And that fear on the Israeli side has been reinforced by the Palestinians en masse and with Arafat cheering on Saddam Hussein of Iraq. During the period of the abortive coup in Moscow, Farouk Kaddoumi, the foreign minister of the Palestinians, the PLO, and Hanan Ashrawi, one of their spokesmen, supported the coup. There are continuing terrorist attacks in Jerusalem and elsewhere. And then Arafat, at the last meeting of the Islamic Conference Organization, urged his fellow Muslim states to call for their jihad or holy war against Israel. Now, of course, he was overruled by the majority of Muslim states, but the Israelis, particularly those who don't want to settle with the Arabs, point to this. Now, during my meetings with Arafat and his colleagues in 1989, I tried to explain to him that the magic words of 1988 only won over about a quarter of the Israeli public, basically the left wing of the Labor Party of Israel, Ma'arach, and the parties to its left, Citizens' Rights, Mapam, and Shinui. In order to really move the peace process forward, he had to take action to win over at least the centrist bloc, which is the right wing of the Labor Party and sort of the left wing or moderate wing of Likud. And to do that, he had to do a series of things like canceling the Palestinian or PLO covenant that still calls for Israel's destruction, saying that any Palestinian refugees who return would only return to the Palestinian state, not to Israel proper, openly denounce terrorism, etc. Unfortunately, as it turned out, he was unwilling to do it, saying he'd gone as far as he could, and for internal domestic political reasons, he couldn't go any further. Unfortunately, by not going further, he not only didn't win over the Israelis, but in fact raised certain questions that still have to be dealt with and did not reassure the critical center bloc. Moving on now to the conflict between Israel and Syria. On the one level, it's on the Golan Heights, this huge massif which, when the Syrians controlled it, was used as a base for shelling and attacking Israel. Now the Israelis control it from the heights. They're only 25 miles from Damascus, and that puts the Syrians in a very difficult security position. It's a very interesting bit of real estate. Whoever controls it has a dominant security position. So the obvious answer would be, well, can't you demilitarize it like the Sinai, basically, so neither side has a strategic advantage? And we'll come on to that. A second area of conflict is Lebanon. I've already mentioned that Lebanon is used as a proxy war area between the Syrians and the Israelis. The Israelis are afraid that the Syrians will use the eastern part of Lebanon, the Bekaa, as a means for a hook around to attack Israel from the north. This is the Israeli fear that the Syrians will come down from the north. The Syrians are afraid the Israelis are going to come up through Lebanon and attack Damascus from the side. And so this Lebanon becomes an issue. And finally, there's a question of what do the Syrians really want? Do they want to lead the Arab world? Would they be happy just with the Golan Heights back? And again, we will deal with that a little bit later. The easiest of these four conflicts between Israel and its neighbors is probably Israel and Jordan. And it's no accident that during the regional talks in Moscow, these turned out to be the most productive. So the Jordanians stayed and talked, the Palestinians and the Syrians, and the Lebanese, who are under the Syrians' control, boycotted. Basically, it's a question of demarcating the border between them, which, at least before the Intifada, was Israel's quietest border, to there's already trade and people moving back and forth between the West Bank and Jordan. Still, however, no demarcated frontiers, lots of possibilities for cooperation in potash production, tourism, etc. All right, when we move from the immediate area of the Arab-Israeli conflict, of Israel-Palestinians, Israel-Lebanon, Israel-Syria, and Israel-Jordan, we move over to the Gulf that we all remember only too well from last year's Gulf War. We have a whole different series of problems, although they are also linked to the Arab-Israeli. First of all, the Arab sheikdoms of the Gulf were organized in the Gulf Cooperation Council. That's Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Bahrain and Qatar and Oman and the United Arab Emirates remain scared to death, literally, of the Iraqis. They still fear an Iraqi attack. The Iraqis have been hiding weapons, building up nuclear and chemical capabilities, even to hydrogen bombs, as we've learned. The Kuwaitis have responded to this now by signing a major military agreement with the United States, as has Bahrain, to try to counterbalance that. They also had a tacit agreement with Egypt and Syria initially after the Gulf War, sort of the GCC +2, where the Gulf states plus the military aid from Syria and Egypt would be there to contain the Iraqis, although that agreement has, to a certain extent, fallen apart. A second concern of the Gulf Cooperation Council states, all of whom are allies of the United States, and rather close allies at that, is Iran. While Iran was quiet during the Iran-Iraq War and maintained its neutrality, you have 51 million Iranians versus roughly 7 million members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, of whom the vast majority are Saudis. There are also residual Iranian claims, and there are Iranian populations on the Arab side of the Gulf, which, by the way, the Arabs call the Arab Gulf and the Iranians call the Persian Gulf. There's also a fear of Islamic expansionism, Shia Islamic expansionism. Again, I will come back to that. Another conflict which remains is the Iran-Iraq conflict. There's been a ceasefire, but neither side trusts the other. It was only papered over during the Gulf War. There's also a good bit of antagonism between Egypt, perhaps the leading Arab state at the time, and Iran. You've got the Egyptians with 57 million people who feel they should be the dominant force in the Middle East, and the Iranians with 51 million people. The Iranians resented when the Egyptians contributed forces to the war against Iraq and tried for a while, had troops there. And when one looks at the Iranian now penetration of the Sudan, it could be a tit for tat telling the Egyptians that, Egypt, you want to play in my backyard? I'm going to play in your backyard. As you know, the Nile runs through the Sudan from Ethiopia into Egypt. All right, we also have continued conflict between Iraq and Syria, mainly a personal conflict, but also a political one, different versions of Baathism. And finally, we have Saudi Arabia and Yemen. The Saudis, after they unified in the 1930s, took a province of northern Yemen and Asir and made it into part of Saudi Arabia. After the Gulf War, they kicked out hundreds of thousands of Yemenis from Saudi Arabia because they were backing, allegedly, the Iraqis, and this has caused a lot of conflict as well. So you've got these interstate conflicts, which are very serious and impact one on the other. In addition to that, you have cross-regional conflicts of a different sort. First of all, the lives of minorities in the Middle East are not very good. At best, they're have second-class status in many of these countries. At worst, they're actively persecuted. We can list the question of the Copts, or Christian Arabs in Egypt, the Jews in Syria, the Arabs in Israel, the Kurds in Iraq and Turkey, you know what's happened to them, blacks in Mauritania and the Sudan, and Berbers of North Africa, to a greater or lesser degree, are discriminated against. And conceivably, since a lot of this discrimination comes because of the fear of conflict or siding with somebody else, would there be a peace process, this situation might be improved. A second area cutting across everybody is water shortages and ecological problems. Last summer, before the bountiful rains that just happened the last couple of months, the Israeli main water source, the Kinneret, was down to its lowest level in recorded history. The Israelis had to stop producing 70% of their cotton, which is a water-demanding crop. And of course, cotton had been a main agricultural product. Jordan was even worse shape. It had been totally overdrawn its water and its aquifers and was facing a tremendous crisis. Syria and Iraq both depend on water coming down from the Euphrates River, which has its headwaters in Turkey. And the Turks from time to time have cut off this water, making life rather difficult for the Syrians and the Iraqis. Egypt, as I mentioned, depends on the Nile, which flows through the Sudan, currently in a hostile relationship with Egypt and Ethiopia, where it originates. Saudi Arabia has been rapidly using up its underground aquifers with fossilized water. I mean, this is the water that's accumulated for thousands and thousands of years. And this is the main water source, other than desalination. It's being rapidly used up because the Saudis decided they wanted to grow wheat. And they wound up using up a lot of their water, and they're going to be in very deep trouble very soon. A third problem cutting across is the lack of democracy in a number of these states. Now, I am not one who argues that because there's a lack of democracy, it will be impossible to come to a peace process. I don't buy into that argument. However, I think what is true is that if Iraq were a democracy, it's very unlikely that it would have attacked first Iran and then Kuwait. And of course, the fourth problem which comes to everybody's mind is the arms race. Conventional arms, chemical arms, biological arms, nuclear arms, stealth technology, smart weapons, we've seen them all at work. All right, we have cross-regional problems and we have interstate problems. Okay, now, how are the actors and are they likely to work in this new situation to work to solve these problems? Let's start with Syria because I think Syria is the key to a lot of this. It's a minority Alawite regime, which is a Shia regime in a basically Sunni Muslim country, only 11% of the population. For many years, it's depended for internal legitimacy, not just on arms, but also in being the leader of the Arab world against Israel. We can be every bit as good Muslims as you because we are, after all, in the confrontation with the enemy of the Muslims, Israel. And were there to be peace between Syria and Israel, a lot of the legitimacy of the regime would disappear. And this raises questions in some minds as to, is Syria really interested in peace? It is an absolutist government ruling through fear. You've seen the article, I'm sure, in the New York Times Magazine a couple of weeks ago. It, however, has problems. It lost its major superpower patron, the Soviet Union, and with it the hopes of getting military parity with Israel. Its economy is weak, although it did get $2 billion worth of aid from the Gulf states for aiding the war against Iraq, which after all was in its own interest, because Iraq being an enemy of Syria. However, it's used most of this money to buy weapons, both from the Soviet Union and from China and also from North Korea. Currently, it is playing all sides off against the middle. What Assad is doing, in my view, is keeping all options open. And let me just tick them off for you. He's with the United States in principle in the peace process and participating in the bilateral talks, but not the regional talks. And that gets him a benefit from the U.S. Hopefully, he thinks, to get off the terrorist list of the U.S. He's forged a new alignment with Egypt, which of course is the Arab state closest to the United States, an increasingly prestigious one in the Arab world, so he's protecting his flank there. On the other hand, he still buys arms from the Soviet Union. He's still tied with Iran, which is, of course, the United States' main enemy currently in the region. And he allows the Hezbollah, which is a Shia Muslim group aided and abetted by the Iranians, to freely operate in Lebanon. He still maintains his ties with the Gulf Cooperation Council, if not providing the military aid, and he's rebuilt his tie to the PLO after a long period of estrangement when Assad tried to assassinate Arafat on a number of occasions. So what you have, therefore, is a leader, Hafiz Assad, with multiple options. If the peace process works out, he can get the Golan back. If it doesn't work out, he can easily resume, because he's kept the right contacts, the lead of the anti-Israeli Arab radicals. We'll see. In a far less pleasant political position is King Hussein of Jordan. Indeed, he was in a desperate economic situation even before the Gulf War, when he chose to back the wrong side. By 1989, Jordan's economy was in such bad shape that to deflect popular anger, he allowed a freely elected parliament for the first time since 1957, when he prorogued the last parliament. Much to his horror, 40% of the seats went to Islamic fundamentalists, who were pushing not only for the Sharia, which is the Islamic law, to be the law of the land, but also to join and actively aid the war against Israel. When Saddam invaded Kuwait, the Palestinians in his kingdom, well, at least 50%, perhaps 60%, cheered Saddam on, as did the fundamentalists, putting poor King Hussein in a position where he had no choice but, so to speak, to follow the street. However, by doing so, he alienated the United States. You may remember back a year ago, February, and basically a year from tonight, where what he said was, by attacking Iraq, the United States has done the worst anti-Muslim and anti-Arab thing in history. A really condemning speech of the United States. Now, his apologists have said, well, he did it because he had to satisfy the street, he had to satisfy Saddam Hussein, but the end result is he wound up alienating lots of people. Once the war was over, he produced a white book, which tried to say that really Jordan did not take the side of Iraq in the war. Egypt took one look at the white book, and according to the Egyptian foreign minister, there was a statement, this is not a white book, but a whitewash of the Jordanian position. $500 million in aid was cut off from the Saudis and the Gulf states, who found his support of Saddam Hussein reprehensible. So when the U.S. brought forth this peace process, this was like a straw to a drowning man. This was his chance to get back in the good graces of the U.S., the good graces of the Gulf states who supported the U.S. in the peace process, and he is, of course, hopefully to get economic aid. But he's facing some tough times. He's facing a 30% unemployment rate, 30% price rise, 60% increase in rents, 400,000 more people in his kingdom than last year without enough water. He's lost $600 million in remittances, again, $500 million in aid from the Gulf states. He's in desperate shape. He needs the economic part of the talks to work, and that's why he has been clearly the most enthusiastic among all the Arab participants, the Palestinians, the Lebanese, the Syrians, and of course the Jordanians, the most enthusiastic for the peace process. Now, also in a difficult political position at the time the peace process started were the Palestinians. Their choice of Saddam Hussein was a disaster, and again, looking back a year, I'm sure you remember Arafat's famous comment that he was fully aware of the military capability of the Iraqis and the war would last at least 3 years and the Iraqis would come out on top. Well, when they didn't, and it was a very quick war, he was in, shall we say, very deep trouble. Not only had he angered Israel, he'd angered the Gulf states the same way that Jordan had angered them. He'd angered Egypt, which again had become the most prestigious Arab state. And now they were in a very difficult political position. No dialogue with the U.S. They're isolated except from support from Yemen and Iraq, which didn't help them very much. A third of their money had been gone because the Gulf states cut off their funding. So they had little choice but to join the peace process. Otherwise, they ran the risk of King Hussein or some of the other Arabs making peace without them, or if the PLO, which is basically secular, chose not to give its support for the peace process, there was the problem that the Islamic fundamentalist movement among the Palestinians, Hamas, on the West Bank, and particularly Gaza, might win increasing power. So they're in, and I think their strategy is this: to use the peace talks for three purposes. One, to rebuild their relationship with the United States. And to a certain extent, they've been successful in doing that. Second goal is to prevent their brother Arabs, quote unquote, from selling them out at the peace talks, and so far they've been able to do that. But these are two relatively minor things. What they really want to do is get, at the minimum, genuine autonomy, which the Israelis have promised them, self-rule on the West Bank and Gaza, but it's not defined what that means. Is it just to collect their own garbage? Is it to run their own schools? Is it to control their own water? This remains to be negotiated. And anyway, if they can get this going, they also hope to use the talks to stop the Israelis from building settlements on the West Bank and Gaza. And because if the Israelis were to continue building them at the rate they're building them now, there would be so many settlements that would preclude the possibility ever of a Palestinian state from coming into being. So those are the Palestinian goals going in. What about Egypt? As I mentioned, 57 million people, a very difficult economic situation, although Mubarak very cleverly used the war to get a lot of his debts wiped off. Something like $25 billion were wiped off of the Egyptian debt, $7 billion from the U.S., another $18 billion from other Arab states, because of Egypt's role politically and militarily in the war. Now, Mubarak, for domestic political reasons, needs the peace process to work. He has his own Islamic fundamentalist opposition. One of the things he's beaten over the head with is, you, Egypt, are the only Arab Muslim state to have peace with Israel. Were other Muslim Arab states have peace with Israel, it would be a lot easier domestically for Mubarak. It would be one less thing for his domestic opposition to hit them with. Saudi Arabia, another country that emerged, I think, quite well from the war, and has actually been giving a good bit of help to the United States in the peace process. They agreed to send observers to the peace talks. Indeed, much to everybody's surprise, a major prince appeared at Madrid giving his blessing, or if I may very carefully mix my metaphors here, making kosher Arab participation in the peace talks by the custodian of the holy places of Mecca and Medina. Very, very important symbolically. He also kept increasing oil production, which in effect lowered oil prices, which made the U.S. quite happy. I should mention that by keeping oil production high and prices low, that also weakens the Iraqis and the Iranians who depend on oil, and they are, of course, two enemies of Saudi Arabia. He's just hosted, the king has just hosted, despite some rather severe criticism from the Islamic religious forces in his own country, he just hosted an American Jewish Congress delegation to talk about the peace process. Here, by the way, the first Jewish political presence in Saudi Arabia, or in Arabia, since Muhammad kicked the Jews out and destroyed their political presence there about 1,200 years ago. Very important symbolically. And again, the Saudis, I think, are being quite helpful in the peace process. The other big joker, however, in the pack is Iran. And I need to spend a couple minutes on Iran. They were big winners from the war. They got 100 warplanes from Iraq. You remember when the Iraqis flew these planes into Iran? These were precisely the same kinds of planes, MiG-29, Sukhoi 24 bombers that the Iranians were getting from the Soviets. So basically, overnight, the Iranian Air Force doubled with the same kinds of planes that the Iranians were learning to fly courtesy of the Soviets. They improved their ties with Western Europe considerably. They got most of their prisoners of war back from Iraq and the border settlement that Iran wanted out of the war in the first place. However, there's a fascinating internal process going on in Iran, which to a certain extent affects the Arab-Israeli peace process. The late and perhaps not lamented Soviet Union had as its ruling party the Communist Party, which had to do things according to the doctrine of Marxism and Leninism, like push Marxist parties in Angola and Mozambique, or in Ethiopia, that were counterproductive to U.S.-Soviet relations. But one of the reasons they needed victories for communism abroad was to legitimate the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. Well, to a certain extent, the regime in Tehran now is an Islamic regime that needs to have an activist Islamic policy around the world to show they are the leaders of Islam. Islam is working. Islam is winning. And that's why it's become so Islamic activist. Now, the question is how far to go. All the leaders, Rafsanjani on the one end and Montashami on the other, are all Islamic. The question is, Rafsanjani is more pragmatic. He say, let's not push it too far, lest the Europeans get, or the Arabs get angry, and Montashami and the others say, no, 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 Islam first, national interest second. And that's the struggle going on now. There was a battle over the opening to the West, the question of liberalizing the economy, but basically what Rafsanjani has done for his own legitimacy, so he could not be attacked from his Islamic right, so to speak, was allow Hezbollah in Lebanon to attack Israel in the name of Islam, pushing still the spread of Islamic fundamentalism, albeit much more quietly, continuing the death sentence against Salman Rushdie for writing this book and not obliterating the decision by Ayatollah Khomeini calling for his murder, and opposing the peace process. Indeed, on the eve of Madrid, there was a peace conference, there was a meeting, anti-peace process in Tehran, where the Montashami, who was a leader, former Minister of the Interior and a leader of the opposition to Rafsanjani, said, quote, all participants in the Madrid conference are enemies of Islam and must face the death sentence. It is a duty of Muslims in the world to carry this out. Well, this kind of thing does not win friends and influence people a lot in the West, nor among the Arab states, and even the Soviets, who were then in their death throes, so to speak, and actively cultivating the Iranians, issued a formal statement denouncing this action. All right, which brings us, of course, to Israel. And what makes the Israelis tick? And let me talk a little bit about that now. So the Israelis are obviously very key to the peace process. One of the issues that still remains at the heart of Israeli thinking is the memory of the Holocaust that destroyed 1/3 of world Jewry. And this memory was reinforced until 1967 by Arab calls to destroy Israel and the PLO Charter, as I mentioned, that still calls for Israel's destruction, and by Arafat's embrace of Saddam Hussein and calling for jihad, etc. The argument is by this group of Israelis, while the fear tends to permeate all Israelis, as a political force it is perhaps active among the right-wing 25%, which is the right wing in Likud, and of course parties to its right, Techiyat, Somet, and Moledet. You can't trust the Arabs. We need every bit of territory for defense. Settlements are good to hold the territory for defense, period. On the other end, there's the 25% of the Israelis who see a real great chance for peace now and argue the Israelis should run into it. This is the left wing of labor and parties to its left, Mapam, Shinui, and Citizens' Right. They say, look, Egypt made peace with Israel in '79 and the peace treaty is holding. Egypt was initially ousted from the Arab world and the Arab League for making peace with Israel. Now it's back in the Arab world, it's back in the Arab League, and an Egyptian runs the Arab League without having broken relations with Israel. This shows that Israel is now being accepted by the Arab world. They argue the Palestinians changed their charter de facto, if not de jure, in 1988 for a two-state solution. They argue the Arab world, except for Iraq, Libya, and Sudan, united to support the peace process. So this is your 25% on the other side that says, let's make peace now, so to speak. Then there are a few objective factors in Israel which are playing across. One, and perhaps the dominant one now, is this huge high-tech Soviet Jewish immigration, 350,000 since 1989, producing 4 times as many PhDs or their equivalent as Israel had before 1989. This group, if it stays in Israel, I've got to emphasize this, if it stays in Israel, will not only help Israel's defense potential, will help Israel's economic potential, its world trade position. Israel, by the way, is the only country in the world to have a free trade agreement, both with the European Economic Community and with the United States, so there's a tremendous amount of potential there if they stay. And of course, there's a tremendous shortage of money for housing and for job creation. And this, of course, brings us to the reality of the loan guarantee. The United States has effectively promised Israel $10 billion in loan guarantees, not $10 billion, but to back Israel in loans for $10 billion if settlements stop. And they've also promised to get Israel or help Israel get another $10 billion in loan guarantees from Japan and Germany. Again, if settlements stop. Okay, and that has become probably the dominant domestic political issue in Israel now, and I'll come back to that. Now, a second objective factor in Israel is the much improved strategic position the Israelis are in. The Soviet threat has ended. The military threat, even though Syria is building up, is much weaker than it was without Soviet backing, and without Russian backing now. The Iraqis, who are a major military threat to Israel for the time being, have been clearly defanged. The Iranians are too far away. The other Arabs are talking peace, which means Israel is in a much better strategic position than it was. In addition, from a diplomatic position, Israel is no longer isolated. Russia's established diplomatic relations. China's established diplomatic relations. Third world leader India's established diplomatic relations with Israel. So Israel is in a much better political strategic position, at least in theory, to make concessions. And of course, the issue is now going to be fought on land for peace and settlements in the campaign. And if this happens, and the latest polls which I have seen, which is the poll taken between the 12th and the 20th of January, show Labor neck and neck and with Likud and Labor winning if Yitzhak Rabin rather than Peres heads the Labor Party, which is rather interesting kind of development. Part of that is the Soviet Jews are swinging increasingly to Labor because Likud is choosing to build settlements on the West Bank and Gaza instead of provide them housing and jobs. So that, of course, obviously is quite important and looks to be watched carefully. Okay. We've now seen the attitudes of the players, the Palestinians, the Israelis, the Jordanians, the Syrians, the Saudis, the Iranians. Now, how do you put all the conflicts and all these attitudes and positions together and come up with a peace plan? Let me conclude with what I think would be a peace plan that would be fair and equitable, of course, in my view, and would solve many, if not all, of the problems. All right. We start off with a demilitarized Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza. A Palestinian state that would be sovereign, but would not have the military capability of threatening Israel's security. There would be certain land trade-offs, obviously. There has to be a connection between Gaza and the West Bank that are separated by Israeli territory. A sort of ocean city-like causeway could be built with, between the West Bank and Gaza, with the Palestinians moving on top, the Israelis underneath, and in return for ceding that, the Israelis should get a strip of land along the Jordan River as extra checks against any infiltrators coming across. Such a state would have rifles and armored personnel carriers, enough to enable it to police its own people, but not enough to present a security threat to Israel. That is, no tanks, no artillery, no rockets or missiles, or formal military air force. That's a real possibility in my view. Similarly, on the Golan Heights, I think a demilitarized Golan Heights, the same way the Sinai is demilitarized with an international force in between, removes the advantage of that region as a jumping off point for Syria attacking Israel or Israel attacking Syria. And now, with the new legitimacy of the UN, and the fact that the Zionism as racism declaration has been removed from the UN, that all the major powers in the Security Council, now with China and Russia doing this in the last few months, have diplomatic relations with Israel, having a UN presence, I think, on the Golan Heights becomes a very serious possibility. And in any peace process, I think, this would be a necessity. A third thing, and relatively easy, would be water. It would be expensive, but it would be easy. It's easy politically because everybody needs it. There are all sorts of great plans that have been on the drawing boards. One, the Turks, who were one of the few peoples in the Middle East with a water excess, had this idea of a peace pipeline. Turkish President Özal came up with this, where he would run this huge pipeline down from Turkey, through Syria, through Jordan, through the West Bank into Israel proper. Since Israel now gets about a third of its water from the West Bank, although it gives some of its own water to Gaza, people said it can't give up the West Bank because it needs its water. Well, one way to prevent that is to run this giant pipeline. Another way is for Japan and the Europeans to contribute to giant desalination plants in the Mediterranean, in the Red Sea, where water could be shared. Another idea that's been raised is running a huge pipe from the Mediterranean, which is on sea level, all the way down toward the Dead Sea or the Beit Shan Valley. The falling water would generate electricity. That could be used for desalination. And Israel, therefore, could provide water to Syria, which would, in effect, be another tie for peace. So this is, I think, critical. Economic cooperation, absolutely. Trade, tourism, cultural relations. Without it, there's no peace. Golda Meir, a former prime minister of Israel, said, "You know when there'll be peace? When I can go shopping in Damascus. That's when there'll be peace." Because merely signing on the dotted line of a peace process doesn't make peace. It's when goods move, people move, cultural groups are exchanged. I mean, look how the U.S. finally warmed up to China or to Russia. A whole series of economic ties, cultural ties, tourist ties, the whole business. All of that is critical because from the Israeli perspective, and I think this is objectively true, the Israelis still have this deep suspicion they're not accepted in the Middle East. Were they to have business relations with the Saudis, business relations with the Syrians, trade and tourism, and the Israeli prime minister can go shopping in the Shuk in Damascus, or the Syrian prime minister or foreign minister can go swimming down in Eilat in Israel. This is the kind of thing that would convince the Israelis that they are indeed accepted and might make them more willing to give up land for peace. So that's critical. And these are, I think, middle stage. If water is an early confidence-building thing, which is easy politically because everybody needs it, this kind of trade, tourism, cultural relations, I think, has to be part of it as well. Arms control is the most difficult issue of all. And I must say that I was quite disappointed that the Syrians, who have a lot to lose here, were not at the arms control talks in Moscow. It's very clear that Israel is not going to give up the nuclear weapons it has unless it's absolutely sure that the Arabs in the Middle East accept it. And that, until they're absolutely sure of that, will take quite a while. On the other hand, the Arab states aren't going to give up their missiles and chemical weapons because they need that as a deterrent against what they see what might be an Israeli attack against them. So you need two things going immediately. You need serious arms control talks. What can you do? What can we do to reduce the threat of war? And there are a number of proposals on the table now. One of which, and by the way, this is directly copied from security in Europe. And those of you who heard lectures about European security, this will be quite familiar. Stockholm Agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1986 called for American observers when the Soviets went on maneuvers and Soviet observers when the Americans went on maneuvers. Similarly, the idea is if there's going to be a Jordanian military maneuver or Syrian military maneuver, Israelis should be there. Similarly, when there'll be an Israeli military maneuver, the Syrians and Jordanians should be there. Another idea has been joint naval forces monitoring the Red Sea against drugs, terrorism, etc. And these are some of the issues that could be, talked about. Now, we have to bring in Iran at this stage because the Gulf military balance does affect the Arab-Israeli balance. The Saudis can say, you're right, Israel, I have all these weapons, but they're not for use against you. They're used against the Iranians, who we don't trust. The Israelis don't know, however, whether these might be used one day against them. So somewhere along the line, the Iranians have to be brought into these military discussions. And you may say, well, if the Iranians are following an Islamic policy, which is anti-Israel, anti-West, so we saw the Judeo-Christian values and encouraging terrorism, how can this be done? Well, the trend in Iran, at least as I see it for the time being, is the pragmatists are winning out. And possibly after the April parliamentary elections or Majlis elections in Iran, you may see possibility a more moderate position on the Iranians, who then might be able to be brought into these talks. From their perspective, they're worried about the whole world ganging up on them, led by the U.S. You bring them into these talks, it might be a way. I think there's going to be no ultimate arms control unless the Iranians are brought in. Then there's the issue of Jerusalem, and that has to be faced, and it cannot be put off indefinitely. A solution, short run, and those of you who remember my talk to the same group 10 years ago, I went into this in more detail. Let me just say it very briefly now, It's got to be done a united city with two different boroughs, a Jewish borough and an Arab borough linked to the Palestinian state. The question of the holy places is not all that hard. There is now an Islamic organization which has been meeting ever since 1969. The Islamic holy places could be put under that Islamic organization. A more difficult problem is obviously with the Christian holy places, because numerous wars, including the Crimean War, have been fought by different Christian powers over who controls the holy places. But this would be a test for ecumenicism, so to speak, and maybe we're now at an ecumenical age where this would be possible. Okay. Finally, there is the issue of the refugee question. And that issue also must be faced and cannot be skirted until the end. There is a Palestinian refugee problem and there is a Jewish refugee problem. The Jews, upon the formation of the State of Israel in 1948, many of them suffered pogroms in Arab states. Many of them had to flee with their lives, with literally the clothes on their backs, leaving a lot of property in the Arab countries. These people have to be recompensed. Similarly, the Palestinians who left either voluntarily or were forced out in 1948-49 war also have to receive compensation. Now, in terms of where people are going to move, the only way for this to work, I think, is for, if there's going to be a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza set up, for the Palestinians to move back to, or move to this Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, not to Israel proper. Were they to move back to Israel proper, the Israelis would see them as a fifth column. It would cause all sorts of problems. But with compensation, a choice, well, I live now in Iraq or I live in Jordan, I don't want to move, okay, your choice is economic compensation. If you do want to move, then move to the Palestinian state. And many Palestinians, including the same way many Jewish Americans do not move to Israel from the U.S., many Palestinian Americans will stay here, but will take pride in a Palestinian state. So I think that absolutely has to be done as well. Finally, if this all works, and this is, of course, I like to end on an optimistic note, and nobody would have even dreamed we'd be as far as we are now in the Middle East peace process a year ago, that's for sure. We may begin to see major joint ventures in tourism. I mean, you can sign up for a tour that will take you from Damascus to Jerusalem to Amman, Jordan, even to Saudi Arabia. And this kind of thing is possible. Israel now gets a lot of its oil from Mexico. What a waste. Get it from the Arab states nearby. The Israelis are world's experts in drip agriculture. This can be a tremendous asset to the Arab states. So, in other words, what I'm suggesting is, while some people see a glass half full or half empty, I, for one, feel we have come a very long way in the overall peace process. Everybody did just about sit down with everybody to talk. Obviously, it's going to be a long peace process. The fact the Israeli elections may well be fought on the peace process issue, I think, is a positive thing. The United States exercises some important leadership along here. We may rapidly move to a peace process. And on that, and a peace settlement. On that happy note, I thank you very much, and we'll open for questions.
For your tour de force, we thank you. I thought for a minute he was going to eliminate all possible questions. But there's one thing nice about the Middle East, and it has endless questions. Mr. Roper.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Byrd. You forgot to mention a very prominent thing that happened recently. Yasser Arafat, 62 years of age, married his secretary, 28. And I'm not too sure what influence...
She's a Christian, by the way.
She's a Christian,
She's a Christian. That's very important.
Very important, absolutely. Thank you. I thought perhaps you would mention that, but obviously that's not important.
Well,
Curious about the February 12th OPEC oil meeting and the role that Saudi Arabia is playing overall in the oil production, in the oil process, in the process of oil in Saudi Arabia. Will that meeting fail as a result of some specific thing? Will it succeed? And what role does the United States, i.e. President George Bush have in the success of that meeting?
All right, the question deals with the upcoming OPEC meeting, the role of Saudi Arabia in that meeting, and is there any political payoff for George Bush? Let me suggest that until now, at least, the Saudis have been more than willing to pump lots of oil. Part of the reason for that is to keep the price down, which makes life much more pleasant in the United States, keeps our inflation rate down, and part of it is a reward for the close U.S.-Saudi alliance during the war, when we in fact did save them, and it's an earnest for future Saudi Arabian-American cooperation. I mean, after all, although we don't have a formal defense pact, what we demonstrated by sending troops in massively to Saudi Arabia, defeating Iraq, and then pulling all of our troops out of Saudi Arabia was we are friends who be called on in time of need. The Saudis recognize this, and as I mentioned in the talk, want to keep a close working relationship. This is number one. Number two, they don't trust the Iranians. There has been a warming of sorts of relations between the Iranians and the United States and Saudi Arabia. However, if the price of oil was to rise very rapidly as a result of huge cuts in oil production from OPEC, this would mean the Iranians would have lots more money to buy Russian submarines or tanks or whatever, which would put Saudi Arabia in a difficult military balance situation vis-a-vis the Iranians, and give the Iranians, who after all have 50 million people vis-a-vis 6 or 7 in Saudi Arabia, in a difficult position. So that's two. Counterbalancing this a little bit is the fact that now the Saudis are the leaders of OPEC and have to be at least a little sensitive to the interests of everybody else there. So what they did a few weeks ago was make a relatively minor cut in production to try to encourage, prices to rise a little bit, because they've been dropping down to $17 a barrel, which is awfully low from their perspective and others' perspectives. So they may sort of go ahead with that. I don't see a huge 3 million or 4 million barrel cut by the Saudis. First of all, nobody's going to scare them into doing it. Secondly, they know they would alienate the U.S. Now, I think all of this is objective fact. Where speculation comes in is and by the way, there's no better region in the world for speculation than the Middle East. What I'm saying now is pure speculation that I heard. A rumor is that the Saudis want to have George Bush reelected. And keeping the oil price low, and Bush can point to that, will help him get reelected. Well, people tend to personalize diplomacy a lot. I wouldn't rule that out, but I don't think that's the central point. Yes, ma'am.
When you talk about a state on the West Bank,
And Gaza.
No, the West Bank. Well, I'm particularly interested in the West Bank because I'm concerned about the settlements. My understanding is you have Arab and Israeli settlements now within a half a mile of each other. So what kind of territorial integrity can a West Bank state have, or will Israel allow it to have?
Well, the question here is in fact a Palestinian state possible with the proliferation of Israeli settlements on the West Bank, primarily, although there are some in Gaza as well. There's still a lot of empty space on the West Bank. If you look at the vast majority of the Israeli settlements, they're built right along the old Green Line, which is right literally on the old border between Israel and what then was Jordanian-controlled territory. The problems lie not so much in those, because there'd probably be territorial adjustments anyway. The problems lie in those that are hit right smack in the middle of heavily Arab-populated areas like Ariel and others. Well, were there to be a peace settlement, it strikes me there would be two options here. The same way Israeli Arabs live as citizens in Israel, those Jews who wanted to stick with those areas for religious reasons could become citizens of the new Palestinian state. I mean, that's one option. Second option is the same way, as a price for peace, the Jewish settlers, Israeli settlers gave up, and by the way, Jew and Israeli is interchangeable in the Middle East, gave up their settlements in the Sinai, and they were evacuated. Similarly, the settlements could be evacuated, and the Jews who live there, Israelis, could be compensated for those, and there is a precedent for that, and that might be great housing for the refugees coming down from Lebanon or Syria. That would be how I would think it should be handled. That's a value judgment on my part, of course. Yes, sir.
Dr. Freedman, the hatred that is so obvious between the Syrians and the Israelis, what seems to be complete obstinacy in the negotiations, with the Syrians virtually saying no more than, so when are we getting back to Golan Heights? I'm wondering, not from the utopian kind of perspective that you've suggested in some of your ideas, but from a practical standpoint, how do you see the Golan Heights situation being resolved? I don't think that the Israelis are going to be that trusting of an international peacekeeping force. I think they want to rely much more on themselves. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, you've raised two issues. The first question of given the hatred between the Syrians and the Israelis, is really a peace settlement on the Golan Heights possible? And secondly, is it realistic to believe the Israelis would ever get down from the Golan Heights given the problems in the past? Well, let's go back in history a little bit. People said exactly the same thing about the Egyptians and the Israelis. Never possible to have a peace. They hate each other too much. And lo and behold, you had a peace agreement signed in '79. It weathered the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. It weathered the assassination of Anwar Sadat. And now, you know, it's cold. Yeah, it's a cold peace in many ways, although there's not the strategic problem. And the Egyptians do sell oil to Israel. The Israeli tourists do go to Egypt, and a few Egyptian tourists come to Israel. There's now an Egyptian academic delegation group studying at Hebrew University. You know, so I mean, this happens, and it did stick, and it stuck over 12 years, and Egypt has now set the precedent for everybody. So I don't take as a given perpetual hatred. Okay, not even between Syria and Israel. That is clearly very strong. On the Golan Heights, I am not totally convinced it's utopian, to use your term, to have ultimately to see a UN force there. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen the day after tomorrow. It's not probably going to happen next month or next year. But somewhere along the line, having the same kind of force as was in the Sinai, after all. You had a multilateral force in the Sinai run by the U.S. In this case, we may see a multilateral force in the Sinai, in the Golan, also run by the U.S. If the Israelis had confidence in the U.S. and the Sinai, although this was a bigger buffer area, conceivably they'd also have, if there was a major U.S. presence, also confidence here. The Syrians at this stage of the game are not going to alienate or anger the U.S. by attacking American troops on the Golan Heights. So I think these would be some of the devices to make it work. But it's a good question, though.
Yes, sir.